Welcome to the 14th Annual International Education Summit and happy International Education Week. My name is Michelle Harpenow and I'm the Executive Director with the World Affairs Council. Welcome to How a Kid from Dayton Helped the Yugoslav Wars, Economic Sanctions, and the Dayton Accords with Rich Lauf and Todd Schwartz. So to kick us off, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Rich Lauf.
Well, thank you, Michelle. You're going to be hearing for the next 40 minutes or so, really about a case study in peace and justice. So the history starts, or at least I'm going to pick up our history, in 1918. Following World War I, the country of Yugoslavia was cobbled together from a number of ethnic enclaves in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which of course at the end of World War II had fallen apart. So these were very different ethnic groups, different languages, different cultures, different religions. And as a result, Yugoslavia never really came together as a country, as we would think of a unified country. It was weak and confused in its own internals. It was occupied by the Nazis in World War II, and it had partisans fighting the Nazis. And following World War II, one of those partisan leaders became the leader of Yugoslavia. He was a communist partisan, Marshal Tito, and he took over and largely held the country together by force. He tamped down the underlying ethnic disputes with an iron hand. I also should point out, though, that while he said he was a communist and ran a communist government, compared to many of the other states of Eastern Europe, he did take his own independent views of the world and was not quite the puppet of the Soviet diplomacy or interest that many of the other countries in Eastern Europe were. So Yugoslavia was a little bit out of that orbit, but still run with an iron hand. At the end of the Cold War and the breakup of the Soviet Union, ethnic frictions that had been bubbling in Yugoslavia for decades developed into open hostilities as various sections and factions, largely ethnic, began to declare some form of independence from the central government in Yugoslavia, eventually saying, yes, we are our own country and we're now no longer part of that central organization. Yugoslavia broke up into pieces. Now that presents a couple problems. Number one, these new statelets argued over where do you draw the boundaries? Because let's face it, there was a mixing of these ethnic groups in various parts. So each country, statelet, ethnic group would look and say, throughout history, they'd go back to the 1500s and say, well, this particular year, this was our territory. And one next door would say, well, yeah, but in 1627, this was our territory. And everybody picked the year that, of course, when their particular part was the biggest, which meant that a lot of the land was claimed 2 or 3 times by these various countries, each pointing to a time on a map when they controlled the most land. So borders became a source of dispute. And secondly, the treatment of my ethnic kinsmen, so to speak, in the other country became an issue. So I say my ethnic group is being badly treated by your country, by your organizations. And I have a right to say something about how my ethnic people are being treated in your country. This is not a prescription for either peace or justice. This is a prescription for conflict, hostility, and abuses. It got to the point where genocidal acts were being created, mass murders, mass rapes, ethnic cleansing, where they're just taking anybody that's not part of my ethnic group and kicking them out of the country. And the Western European powers in the US realized that this was a humanitarian crisis of major proportions and intervened, and NATO intervened. And eventually, international diplomacy led to the Dayton Accords. They're called the Dayton Accords because they were negotiated and signed right up at Wright Pat Air Force Base in Dayton. The peace agreement settled things down, although NATO troops remained in the area to keep the peace. So getting to peace was a major undertaking of negotiation of all the parties, ending in the Dayton Accords. Let me tell you just a little bit about Todd Schwartz. I was delighted when he agreed to speak. He had a very distinguished career as a Foreign Service officer in the US State Department. And as Michelle pointed out, he now serves our region as the director for the European American Chamber of Commerce, helping to create links, business links and trade. Todd graduated from Miami University. He became a Foreign Service officer in 1987. And in the Q&A, some of you may be interested in what does it mean to be a Foreign Service officer? How does one get to be one? And what do they do for a living? He's going to tell you some of what they do for a living. But I will point out that in the course of his work for the US State Department, he had overseas posts in Germany, Saudi Arabia, Tunisia, Qatar, Kuwait, and several other countries, as I recall. And he once told me the story of learning Arabic so that he could operate effectively in the Middle East. You might want to ask about that too. His Washington duties, when he wasn't overseas working on behalf of our government, he was the director of the Office of Iraqi Economic Affairs, and he was the director of the Office of Iran Affairs. So you can see that the State Department entrusted him with some very serious responsibilities on key international issues. He retired from the State Department with the rank of consular. Just to give you a point of comparison, that's the equivalent of a brigadier general, basically. Todd's a real expert. I read a lot about international affairs, and sometimes my head explodes and I'm puzzled and say, what is really going on here? I'll pick up the phone and give Todd a call, and I always get valuable perspective from him. And I'll turn it over now to Todd, and I'm sure you will find you get valuable perspective from Todd.
Hey, Rich, thanks so much. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. I'm really proud to be associated with the World Affairs Council, and I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to talk with you guys today. So let me just say a little bit about the European American Chamber. As Rich says, I'm the executive director of that organization. It's about 15 years old, and you know, we help to promote business ties and trade ties between the Cincinnati region and Europe. You probably don't know, but there's well over 250 actually European companies that operate in and around the Cincinnati region. That's a lot of jobs, and I'm proud to be able to help support those companies. But I'm not here to talk about this. I'm talk about that. I'm here to tell you the story about how I had an opportunity to make a positive difference, and how I got there and how I did that. And you know, again, this isn't a deep dive into foreign policy, but it's just a story about how somebody with a background really not that different from yours, just a kid from Dayton, you know, how you can actually do something really important. And just a couple things that Rich didn't talk about. I mean, when I say I'm a kid from Dayton, I mean, I was born in Indiana. Born in Jeffersonville, Indiana, just across the river from Louisville. Moved to Dayton when I was 9 years old. Actually lived in the Centerville neighborhood in Dayton. Went to Normandy Elementary, went to Watts Middle School, graduated from Centerville High School in 1982. Go Elks. And as Rich said, I was very proud and very honored to be able to be accepted at Miami University. Enrolled there in the fall of 1982 and studied business. And also, as Mindy pointed out, Miami has some wonderful international programs, and I was very, very happy to participate in the Miami University Luxembourg program. I was there the entire school year from 1984 to 1985. I am also a Miami merger. My wife graduated from Miami. Two of my children graduated from Miami University as well. So I'm a big fan of Miami, and very happy to consider myself a Red Hawk alumni. That Luxembourg program was wonderful. It gave me the opportunity to travel around Europe to see different perspective. Just an ad for the World Affairs Council. That's the whole purpose of this program, is to give you the opportunity to have international experiences and to gain different perspectives. And again, salute the World Affairs Council for its work in that area, and encourage you as students to try to get that as best you can. Anyway, back to my story. Came back from from Luxembourg, was finishing my degree in business economics. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, like many college students. When I graduated, I said, well, you know, undergraduate degree in business economics, what do you do with that? I said, I'll go to graduate school. Maybe I'll go to law school. But instead, I took a test called the Foreign Service Officer Test. It's a written examination. It's the first step in the process of becoming a Foreign Service Officer. And if you ever think about doing something like that, you can go to a website called careers.state.gov. It talks about careers with the State Department. But just a little bit of overview. What does a diplomat do? What does it mean to be a member of the Foreign Service? Diplomats are not, as some people say, striped pants cookie pushers who go to cocktail parties all the time. Some diplomats do that. Other diplomats help American citizens who run into trouble overseas, that lose their passports or get arrested, or get stranded because of a pandemic and have no way to get home. Other members of our diplomatic corps are responsible for keeping the embassy safe. Others make sure that that we have paper for the printers and for that the computers work. And then other diplomats do the kind of work that I did. My primary responsibility in my career was helping U.S. companies who are doing business overseas to make sure that we trade goods on terms that are fair to everybody. Most diplomats work for the U.S. Department of State. Some work for the Department of Agriculture. Some work for the Department of Commerce. And most diplomatic careers involve extended periods of time overseas. But as Rich pointed out, there's also opportunities in Washington. My first two jobs with the State Department were overseas. My first two assignments. My first assignment was in Frankfurt, Germany. That's Frankfurt, West Germany. So very long time ago, back when it was still West Germany. I moved there with my wife. My first son was actually born in West Germany. We lived in an apartment that the consulate, which was a branch office at the embassy, had provided for us. And my primary job there was helping American citizens who needed passports and to give visas or permission for non-Americans to come and visit the United States. After Frankfurt, we went to Saudi Arabia, where we lived in the Haran, Saudi Arabia, which is the headquarters of the world's largest oil company, Saudi Aramco. And while I was there, I learned a lot about how oil gets bought and sold and refined and transported. And that's going to become important to this story just a little bit later. Now, if you know, I was in Saudi Arabia. Actually, we got there in 1989. I left Saudi Arabia in 1991. Some of you that know a little bit about the history of the region may remember in August of 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. I was there through that whole environment. And so I also, while I was in Saudi Arabia, got this handy dandy gas mask to protect me from chemical gas attacks that Saddam Hussein was launching against U.S. forces and international forces. Not really a part of the story, but you know, all the life of a diplomat isn't just happy and glamour. Anyway, finished that assignment. In 1992, I moved back to Washington. I got a job in something called the Office of Global Energy at the State Department in Washington, D.C. My job was to keep an eye on global oil markets, and in particular, the countries of the Middle East. And at that time, and still today, oil from that region is very important to the world economy. And so anything that would impact the flow of oil from that region, from natural disasters to political unrest to Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, that was something that America's political leaders needed to know about, anticipate, and hopefully try to keep from participating or keep from happening. So that leads us back to Serbia and Montenegro. So I'm in this job. I've started this job. Um, Now, back as early as 1991, as Rich was saying, the European Union had already started to impose economic sanctions on Serbia and Montenegro because of this growing unrest. And as he said, sanctions are really just a fancy way of trying to restrict trade to encourage a company to change its policy direction. In 1992 and 1993, the UN Security Council, so at a global level, the UN, is passing a number of resolutions imposing additional economic sanctions, including bans on all international trade, scientific and technical cooperation, sports and cultural exchanges, and travel of government officials from the former Republic of Yugoslavia. There was a resolution passed in November of 1992 that banned all inward and outward maritime shipping. So another set of sanctions. Just to be clear, I mean, again, as Rich said, the intent of the sanctions is not just to strangle the economy. I mean, obviously, a ban like this would not only stop weapons and ammunition and fuel and all the other things that you need to fight a war from getting into the country, but the ultimate goal is to demonstrate that the policy that the country is following just is untenable. It won't stand. We're not going to support any a policy of ethnic cleansing, and that the government, the intent is to drive the government to a negotiating table so that it can find a way to live peacefully and in justice with its neighbors. Now, if you look at a map of the region, which I think Hannah is going to put up, you know, as Rich said, it's one thing to pass a resolution like this, but it's a very different thing to enforce it. If you look at the red line on that map, you'll see that's the Danube River. The Danube River there starts up in Germany, just north of Switzerland, flows, you know, through Germany, through Austria, Hungary, Yugoslavia at the time, now Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, and then empties into the Black Sea. The river there is a very important international waterway. And, so trade moves from Germany through Austria, Hungary, and in both directions from the Black Sea up into Central Europe and vice versa. And as you see, that river runs right through Serbia and smack through the center of Belgrade. So how do you stop illicit trade that might be moving, fuel or weapons or other things into Serbia and not strangle the economy of Hungary or Austria or Germany and all the goods and products that might be flowing up and down the Danube to some of those other 10 countries or other 9 countries that lie along the river? How do you enforce these kind of sanctions without strangling those countries? Well, that was the question. In 1993, on February 12th, the Secretary of State established a U.S. interagency task force on Serbia-Montenegro sanctions to answer that question. What's a task force? A task force is just a way to get all of the different elements of the United States government into one room to address a crisis. Could be a pandemic, could be a plane crash, could be all different kinds of things. So in our case, the task force brought together a couple different key elements. It brought together the intelligence community. These were the people who could help us identify efforts by foreign governments and foreign companies to evade sanctions, and sometimes US companies. The task force brought together law enforcement because in most countries, evading sanctions is something that's against the law. The task force brought together the U.S. military because they could communicate with other militaries as well as employ their own assets if for some reason we needed to act to move against a target to stop illicit trade. The task force brought together the Treasury Department because all of this, as Rich has said, is fueled by money that moves around the world, moving between banks. And so the Treasury Department can help with that. And of course, then they had the State Department. Our role was really to coordinate everything in Washington. And most importantly, we had the assets on the ground in the embassies and consulates that we had across Europe and around the world. The ones that could provide us with accurate information and also that could undertake our instructions to work with local governments to enforce sanctions. How did I get on the task force? Well, I was asked specifically, again, because of my knowledge of global energy markets. We had a really good sense of what kind of fuel the Serbians and the Montenegrins needed for their power plants, and we knew how they normally would get it. As their regular sources for oil, for coal, for natural gas dried up, our job was to figure out what was the Serbian government doing to try and replace that fuel, and how do we stop it. Ultimately, again, it sounds really complicated and interesting, and at the heart of it, though, it's really simple. And I'm just going to provide an example, and I'm just making this up. I'm not giving away any secrets. Let's just say our intelligence agencies discovered that the Serbians had signed a contract for the delivery of oil from a refinery in Vienna or in Austria. So the company selling the oil, so it's an Austrian refinery, but let's say the company that's contracting for the sale is based in Thailand. The barge that's going to transport the oil is owned by a Dutch company, but it sails under a Greek flag. And then let's say the whole transaction is being financed by a bank based in London. So the task force gets this information, does a little bit of research, nails down this information, and we spring into action. As soon as we've got that, we've started to write telegrams, write messages to our embassies, and our embassies in Vienna and in Thailand and in the Netherlands and in Greece and in London, they are all on their phones with, or they are in the offices of their counterparts, the appropriate counterparts in those countries. They're sharing the information that the task force has developed. They are explaining how that transaction is subverting the intent of these international sanctions, and they are demanding the governments, in line with the demands of the Security Council, they're demanding them to take actions. So we'll tell the Austrians they need to prevent the barge from being loaded with oil. If the barge has already left the refinery, we'll tell them to stop it before it leaves Austrian waters. If it's left Austrian waters, we'll tell the Hungarian government to stop it before it gets to Serbian waters. In Thailand, the embassy will tell the government that they need to prosecute the company that is illegally selling oil to Serbia in violation of UN sanctions. We'll tell the Dutch government that they need to take actions against the owners of that barge. We'll tell the Greek government that they need to deflag that vessel, which means basically removing the licensing, the national licensing of that vessel, so that it can't attain insurance. And no captain's going to sail unless his ship has got insurance. In London, we'll be asking the government to freeze the bank accounts of everybody involved in this transaction. Now, any one of these actions should be sufficient to stop the transaction. Doing them all simultaneously, most importantly, sends the signal to the Serbian government, as well as to all of the other governments involved in this effort, that we're serious and that these sanctions are going to bite. And that was my job. I spent about 3 months on this task force, reviewing, analyzing information that we would receive to identify the suspicious transactions, and we would prepare the instructions to the embassies, telling them to stop them. We would analyze where we might be missing things. What were the holes that the Serbians were finding, or that we hadn't yet found, so that we could take action there and say, well, we need to look at this, or we need to look at that. And most importantly, we also kept a very comprehensive record of everything that we were doing, all the different activities, because of course we had to report to Congress. We had to report to our leadership on what was going on. Sometimes we would have to elevate issues. If the embassy couldn't get action, we might have to convoke an ambassador, a foreign ambassador, in to meet somebody at the State Department or even to the White House to receive instructions. And of course, we also had to keep good records so we could report to Congress. And most importantly, or well, not most importantly, but also, it's important to have a good historical record of some of these things, so that we know for later analysis and for historical purposes. So that was my job, and that's what I did for, like I say, about 3 months. And I was very proud to do that work, because I knew that it was both reinforcing the integrity of the United Nations process, and I knew that it would help to end the humanitarian disaster that Rich was describing. So a few months after I left the task force, I got word that I was to receive an award for my work. And we had a very nice ceremony, and I and several of my colleagues were recognized for what I'd done. And I got this very nice meritorious honor award. It actually came in a frame. I took it out of a frame because when you do this job for as long as I do, you move a lot, and I had lots of frame pictures. And Hannah's going to put up a picture so you can see that. And I know you can't read the language on their certificate, but if Hannah will put that up, I'll read it to you so you can see what it says. It says a Meritorious Honor Award, Todd Schwartz, in recognition of superb performance in support of U.S. policy initiatives regarding the former Yugoslavia and the UN sanctions against Serbia and Montenegro. His energetic efforts in international coordination of sanctions enforcement have been a major factor in achieving our UN sanctions goals. And it's signed by the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, Peter Tarnoff, which of course none of you know who that is, but I do, and I'm pretty cool. So that's what the certificate said. And Hannah, if you'll put me back up, you'll see, in addition to that, I got these handy dandy awards, medals, and it says right on there, Meritorious Honor Award. And just like a military officer, you know, we get medals too. So now, just to finish up, now that was just my third assignment with the Foreign Service. As I was 6 years into my career when I got that. As you heard Rich say, I spent 28 years with the State Department in fun places like Kuwait and Iraq and the Philippines, and got a number of other different awards and certificates during my career. That's the story for another day. That's the story I wanted to tell you today. Just to conclude, again, you know, just a kid from Dayton who graduated from a state school in Ohio that shared a name with a university in Florida that isn't even based in the city that it says it's named after. University of Miami's in Coral Gables. So there you go. That's my story. And you know, I'm hoping you got some questions and some interest. But if nothing else, I hope you find it useful to learn kind of what careers in the State Department are like. And again, if you want to learn more, careers.state.gov. It's not for everybody, but it was the best job I ever had.